The first thing you need to know about Danny Jarvis is that he wasn't the kind of person who panicked out loud. He panicked quietly, the way farmers do, because if you say it out loud, it becomes real, and once it's real, you still have to finish the chores anyway. The tractor started making the noise 3 days before he admitted something was wrong. At first, it was just a rough edge in the sound, a little scrape under the steady rhythm, the sort of thing you tell yourself is bad fuel or cold metal or your imagination. But by Monday morning in March of 1968, it had turned into a grinding, clanking rattle that didn't belong in any engine that wanted to live. Danny sat on that seat and felt the vibration travel up through his legs like a warning. He listened hard, then did what he'd been doing since his father died. He counted. Not just the acres that needed work and the days left before the ground had to be turned, but dollars. In his pocket, he had 23. Not 23 and some change. Not 23 tucked away somewhere else. 23 that he could touch right then. Back home, there might be a little more in the coffee can, but might be didn't fix a tractor. What fixed tractors was parts and time, and someone who knew what they were doing. Danny knew enough about machines to understand when a sound meant pay attention, and when a sound meant this is going to take your whole season if you let it. He finished what he could that morning with the tractor complaining every minute, and when it got so bad he couldn't pretend anymore, he made the decision farmers hate most. He stopped working and went looking for help. Becker Equipment was 12 miles from his farm in Caddo County, Oklahoma, and that 12 miles felt like a dare. Every rotation of the wheels sounded like it might be the last. Danny drove slow, not because he wanted to, but because he was bargaining with the engine like it could hear him. Just get me there, he thought. Get me there, and I'll figure out the rest. The dealership sat there like it always had, big lot, rows of equipment, the kind of place that smelled like oil and money and decisions. Danny pulled in and shut the tractor down, and the sudden quiet made his ears ring. For a second, he just sat, not because he was resting, but because he was bracing. Then the door opened, and Carl Becker stepped out. Carl was 53, with the posture of a man who'd spent his life standing on concrete. He'd been selling John Deere tractors for 25 years, and he had that look that comes from watching other people spend their savings. He didn't rush. He didn't have to. He walked over, listened to the dying Farmall H as Danny started again, and he tilted his head the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat he already doesn't like. "That doesn't sound good, son," Carl said. Danny swallowed. "No, sir, it doesn't." Carl leaned closer, waited for the grind, for the irregular knock, for the ugly rhythm that didn't match the rest. Then he straightened and gave Danny the kind of honesty that feels like a door closing. "Crankshaft," he said. "Cracked or broken. You're not going anywhere on that tractor until it's fixed." The words hit Danny in the stomach. He'd known something major was wrong. He just hadn't wanted it to be the heart of the engine. He'd learned what a crankshaft did from watching his father rebuild equipment at the kitchen table with greasy hands and a quiet patience that made everything seem solvable. It turned the pistons up and down into power you could use. When it cracked, it wasn't just a part. It was a verdict. Danny asked anyway, because you always ask. How much to fix it? Carl wiped his hands on a rag that looked like it had seen 100 deals. He did the math without writing it down, like he'd done it 1,000 times. "New crankshaft machining labor," he said. "You're looking at $800, give or take." Danny didn't react right away. Not because he didn't understand, but because his brain tried to find somewhere to put that number. 800 might as well have been 8 million. Danny stared at the tractor and felt the edges of his life press in. He had a farm that didn't wait for feelings. The ground needed plowing in 3 weeks. He needed the machine, and he needed it now. "I don't have that kind of money, Mr. Becker," Danny said, and he tried to keep his voice even. Carl didn't sound cruel when he answered, but he didn't sound soft either. "I know you don't, son. Nobody your age does." Then Carl did what men in his position do when they've already decided the problem is someone else's. He offered an easier ending. "I can give you another option," he said. "I'll buy the whole tractor for $200. Scrap value. You can put that towards something newer, something that works." Danny looked at the Farmall H and felt something tighten in his chest. That tractor wasn't just steel. His father had bought it used in 1952. Danny had learned to drive on it. It had worked their 160 acres for 16 years. It had done spring after spring and harvest after harvest with a kind of stubborn reliability that felt like family. $200. Carl shrugged like he was being generous. That's the best I can do, he said. Engine's shot. Nobody's going to pay more for a dead tractor. Danny stood there with a March wind cutting through his jacket, looking at the lot full of machines he couldn't afford, looking at his hands that knew work but didn't know how to make 800 appear. He could feel the calendar ticking in his head. Plowing, planting, bills, and that quiet fear that comes when you're responsible for something too big to carry. He'd been afraid of that feeling ever since 1965, since the day his father, Harold Jarvis, dropped in the middle of spring planting and didn't get back up. Heart attack. Sudden. Final. Danny was 19, and 1 minute he was a farm kid helping out, and the next minute he was the farmer because there was no one else. His older brother Tom had already left for the oil fields in Texas. His sister Ellen was 14 and still in school. Their mother, Mary, did what she could, but the farm didn't care about grief. The farm wanted hands. It wanted decisions. Danny had buried his father and then gone back to the field because the season didn't pause for funerals. He learned fast, and he learned tired. He learned that sometimes you wake up and you feel older than you are because you have to. That's who Danny was when he stood in Carl Becker's parking lot with $23. Not a dreamer, not a hero, just a young man with no room to fail. He looked back at Carl and heard himself ask the question before he had time to talk himself out of it. What if I fixed the crankshaft myself? Carl laughed. Not a mean laugh. Not exactly, but the kind that says the conversation is over. Son, Carl said, shaking his head, you can't fix a cracked crankshaft. That's precision machining. You need a machine shop, specialty tools, years of training. It's not something you do in your barn with a hammer and good intentions. Danny felt his face warm, not from embarrassment, not yet, but from the pressure of being cornered. He thought about his options. Pay money he didn't have. Sell the tractor for $200 and gamble his farm on some unknown replacement. Or try something that sounded crazy when a man with 25 years of experience said it. Danny's mind went, automatically, to the one skill he'd built before he ever became the owner of a farm. Welding. Back in high school, when other boys were playing football or chasing girls, Danny spent his free periods in shop class. Mr. Patterson ran that class. Former Navy welder. World War II. The kind of man who treated a weld like a promise. Welding isn't just about melting metal, Mr. Patterson used to say. It's about understanding metal. How it moves when it heats, how it shrinks when it cools, how stress finds the weakest place. You master that, and you can fix almost anything. Danny had mastered it more than most kids ever did. By his senior year, he was doing work that made even Mr. Patterson pause and nod. He had steady hands. Patient hands. The kind of hands that didn't rush, because rushing is how you ruin things you can't afford to replace. Mr. Patterson once told him he could make a living welding. Danny had said, I'm going to be a farmer, like my dad. And Mr. Patterson had smiled and said, then you'll be a farmer who can weld. That's a powerful combination. Danny hadn't realized how right that was until now. He looked at Carl and asked, carefully, like he was testing whether the idea would collapse the moment he said it. What about welding, he said. Could I weld a crack? Carl's laugh got louder. Weld a crankshaft, Carl said, like the words tasted funny. He shook his head, still chuckling. Look, I admire your spirit. I do. But some things just can't be fixed. A cracked crankshaft is one of them. The stress, the heat, the precision, weld would never hold. You'd be wasting your time and your money. Danny didn't like the way wasting sounded, as if his time wasn't already being spent on survival. How much would it cost me to try? Danny asked. Carl sighed, like he was humoring a kid who needed to touch the stove once. $10 for materials, he said. But you'd be throwing it away. That weld won't last a month. Maybe not even a week. There's a pause then, the kind of pause where a young man decides whether he'll let someone else write the ending. Danny could feel Carl's certainty like a weight. He could also feel something else, quiet anger. Yes, but more than that, a stubbornness that had grown in him since his father died. The kind of stubbornness that says, if this is going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong on my terms. Danny nodded once. I'll take my chances, he said. Carl's smile faded into something like disbelief. "Son," Carl started, but Danny was already climbing back onto the tractor. He started the engine, and it sounded like it was mocking him with every knock. He drove it off the lot, and he didn't look back because if he looked back he might see the doubt on someone else's face and let it become his own. Carl watched him go, shaking his head. Danny didn't hear what he said to his mechanic, but it would have sounded like the sentence people love to say when they think they're protecting you. That boy is going to learn an expensive lesson. The drive home was worse than the drive in. The sound got uglier. The steering wheel trembled. Danny kept one hand on it and one hand on the throttle like he was trying to calm a horse that wanted to bolt. And under the noise, under the stress, a second voice kept talking in his head. It sounded like Mr. Patterson. "Slow, practical, understanding metal," it said. "Stress, heat, weak places." Danny didn't know if welding a crankshaft was possible the way Carl meant possible. He knew it wasn't supposed to work. He knew the smart money said sell it, walk away, move on. But Danny didn't have smart money. He had $23 and a farm that needed a tractor. He had a barn. He had tools. He had a welding torch. He had the memory of a teacher who taught him not to treat metal like magic, but like something you could learn. When he got home, he parked the Farmall in the barn and shut the doors. Not because he was hiding, but because he needed quiet. He needed space to think without anyone watching him fail. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the tractor the way you look at a problem you can't afford to lose to. He thought about his father, about how Harold used to say there are two kinds of men, the ones who wait for permission and the ones who get to work. Danny reached into his pocket and felt the $23. It felt small for what he was about to ask it to do. Then he took a breath and made a plan that didn't sound heroic or dramatic. It sounded desperate and practical. He was going to take the engine apart. He was going to find the crack. He was going to decide, with his own eyes, whether it was truly impossible or just inconvenient. And if there was even a chance, he was going to spend whatever he had on the right rod, the right wheel, the right files, anything that could turn a no into a maybe. Because if he was going to lose the tractor, he wasn't going to lose it without a fight. He rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a wrench, and started loosening the first bolt. Every turn felt like commitment. Every part he set aside felt like stepping farther away from the safe choice. The Farmall sat silent, heavy and patient, like it was waiting to see whether the kid who'd grown up on it was about to save it or bury it. Danny worked through the rest of Monday carefully, slow enough not to break anything he couldn't replace. By the time the light started to fade, he had grease on his forearms and a pile of parts laid out like a map. He was tired, but the tired didn't scare him. He'd been tired for 3 years. What scared him was what he might see when he finally pulled the crankshaft free. Because once he saw the crack with his own eyes, there would be no pretending. Either it was fixable, or Carl Becker's laugh was going to be the last sound in Danny's head for a long time. Danny didn't sleep much that night. Not because he was nervous about the work, but because once you start taking an engine apart in your head, it's hard to turn it off. Every bolt, every bearing, every step of the process kept replaying behind his eyes while he lay there in the dark listening to the quiet house breathe around him. Around midnight, he got up, walked into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of cold coffee from the pot his mother had left on the stove, and sat down for a minute with his elbows on the table. $23. That number had a strange weight to it. It wasn't much money, but it was everything he had to work with. Enough for welding rod, if he chose carefully. Enough for a grinding wheel. Enough, maybe for a chance. He finished the coffee, stood up, and went back out to the barn. The air was colder now, and the tractor sat where he had left it, half open like a patient waiting on the table. Danny flipped on the light and walked over slowly, studying what he had already done. He wasn't rushing. He couldn't afford to rush. A mistake here didn't just cost money. It cost time, and time was the one thing the farm never gave back. He worked until his hands knew what to do without thinking. Bolts came loose. Parts came free. The smell of old oil mixed with the quiet scrape of metal on metal as he laid each piece down in order so he'd remember how it all fit together. By Tuesday morning, the crankshaft finally came out. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that reminds you how much work that piece of steel had done over the years. Danny set it on the workbench and wiped his hands on a rag before leaning closer. For a moment, he didn't see it. Then he turned the shaft slightly, and there it was. The crack ran across one of the main bearing journals like a thin pencil line. Not dramatic, not wide, just enough to ruin everything. Danny stared at it for a long time. He imagined what Carl Becker had seen in that same kind of damage 100 times before: scrap metal. Replace the part. Move on. That was the professional answer. But Danny wasn't thinking like a dealer. He was thinking like a farmer with no spare parts and no spare money. He ran his finger lightly across the fracture and felt the faint edge where the steel had separated. A regular weld wouldn't hold. Carl was right about that part. A crankshaft spins thousands of times a minute under pressure that would tear most things apart. If the weld created uneven stress, the crack would just come back. Maybe worse. Danny leaned back against the bench and crossed his arms, staring at the piece of metal like it might tell him something if he gave it enough time. His mind started replaying things Mr. Patterson had taught him years earlier. Preheat the metal so the weld doesn't shock it. Cut the crack open so the new metal has somewhere to sit. Layer the weld slowly. Let cool slowly too. Most people rush the cooling. That's where the real damage hides. Danny stood there for a long time, working through the problem step by step until the impossible thing started to feel less impossible and more like a very difficult job. Around noon, he wiped his hands again and drove into town. The hardware store owner knew him well enough not to ask too many questions. Danny picked out the best welding rod he could afford, the kind rated for high-stress repairs. Then he grabbed a grinding wheel and a set of small files from the auto parts store down the road. $15. That left him with $8 in his pocket. When he drove back to the farm, he felt strangely calm. Not confident exactly, but focused. There's a difference between hoping something works and deciding you're going to do everything possible to make it work. Danny wasn't hoping anymore. He was working. The first step was grinding out the crack. He fitted the grinding wheel carefully and started widening the thin fracture into a shallow V-shaped groove. Sparks jumped away from the steel in short, bright bursts while the wheel chewed slowly along the damaged line. Danny kept the pressure steady, not too much, letting the metal tell him when it was enough. By the time he finished, the crack looked bigger, uglier, but also cleaner, a place where new metal could live. Then he prepared the rest of the shaft. If he was going to do this, he had to treat the whole piece the same way a machine shop would. He set up a slow heat source and warmed the entire crankshaft gradually. Not hot enough to glow, just enough to raise the temperature evenly so the weld wouldn't cool too quickly in one spot and tear itself apart in another. It took patience. Hours of it. Danny sat nearby on an overturned bucket, watching the thermometer he'd borrowed from Mr. Patterson's shop, adjusting the heat a little at a time. The barn was quiet except for the occasional pop of warming metal. By the time the shaft was ready, it was well into the evening. Danny rolled his shoulders, pulled on his gloves, and lowered the welding mask. The first arc flashed bright against the dark metal. The sound of the torch filled the barn with that steady electrical buzz he'd known since high school. He moved slowly, building the weld in layers the way Mr. Patterson had drilled into him. Not rushing, not forcing the metal. Let flow. Let settle. For hours passed that way. Bead after bead, laid carefully into the groove until the crack was no longer a crack, but a raised line of fresh steel. Danny finished the final pass sometime after midnight. When he lifted the mask, his eyes ached and his back felt like it had been holding the world up all night. But the work wasn't done yet. The most dangerous moment for a weld like this was the cooling. If it cooled too fast, tiny fractures could form inside the metal where no one could see them. Danny wrapped the crankshaft in insulating blankets and left it to cool as slowly as possible. 12 hours. That's how long he gave it. When Wednesday morning came, he unwrapped the shaft and ran his hand across the welded area. The metal was solid. Now it had to be shaped. Danny spent most of that day grinding and polishing the weld down until the surface matched the original curve of the journal. Then he used the borrowed measuring tools to check alignment, roundness, balance, everything that mattered for a part that would spin thousands of times per minute. He checked it again and again until the numbers lined up as close to perfect as his hands could manage. By Thursday night, he was ready to put the engine back together. The reassembly took nearly as long as the teardown because Danny refused to hurry. Every bearing seated carefully. Every bolt tightened exactly where it belonged. By Friday morning, the tractor was whole again. The barn was quiet when Danny climbed into the seat. For a second, he just sat there with his hands on the steering wheel. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the understanding that this next moment was going to tell him whether 2 days of work had saved his farm or wasted the last money he had. He turned the key. The engine hesitated once, then caught. The sound filled the barn, and Danny froze, listening. Not for perfection, just for disaster. The engine idled. Steady. No grinding. No clunking. Just the deep, rhythmic hum he remembered from before the crack. Danny let it run that way for nearly an hour. He walked around the tractor, listening from every angle like Carl Becker had done. Still smooth. Still steady. Finally, he climbed back up and eased the tractor out of the barn. The tires rolled across the dirt yard while the engine kept its calm rhythm. Danny drove one slow circle, then another. Still nothing wrong. The weld was holding. He drove out to the edge of the field and turned back toward the house. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't victory yet. It was something better. A chance. By Monday morning, the story had already begun traveling through Caddo County. Small towns move information faster than any newspaper. Someone had seen Danny driving the tractor again. Someone else had heard he welded the crankshaft himself. By the time Carl Becker heard about it, the rumor had grown large enough that he decided to see it with his own eyes. He drove out to the Jarvis farm that afternoon and found Danny halfway down a row, plowing like nothing unusual had happened. Carl stood at the edge of the field with his hands in his coat pockets, listening to the engine that should have been dead. When Danny reached the end of the row, he shut the tractor down and climbed off. "Mr. Becker," he said. Carl looked at the Farmall, then back at Danny. "I heard you fixed it." "Yes, sir." "You welded the crankshaft?" Danny nodded. Carl leaned down and ran his hand along the side of the engine block like he was checking the pulse of something he didn't quite trust. Then Danny started the tractor again. Carl listened closely for almost a full minute. When he stood back up, he shook his head slowly. "I've been in this business 25 years, he said. "I've never seen anyone weld a crankshaft and make it hold." Danny shrugged a little. "First time for everything." Carl studied him with an expression that wasn't quite respect yet, but it wasn't the same laugh from the dealership either. "It won't last," Carl said finally. "Maybe a month. Maybe a year if you're lucky. But eventually the stress will crack it again." Danny didn't argue. He just smiled slightly. "Then I'll weld it again." Carl laughed, but this time the sound was different. Less certain. Almost curious. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" he said. Danny glanced at the tractor beside him. "My father used to say that was my best quality." Carl turned to leave, then paused and looked back once more. "If you ever want a job," he said, "come see me. A man who can fix things that can't be fixed might be useful." Danny nodded politely. "I've got a farm to run." Carl drove away after that, still shaking his head a little. And as he disappeared down the road, the Farmall H kept running in the field behind Danny's house, the weld turning quietly inside the engine with every revolution, carrying a question no one in Caddo County could answer yet. Not whether Danny Jarvis had pulled off the impossible, but how long the impossible could last. For the first few weeks, Danny Jarvis kept waiting for the weld to fail. Not in a dramatic way, not like the engine exploding or the tractor collapsing in the middle of the field, but in the quiet way problems usually return. A small knock, a vibration that didn't belong, something that would make him stop the engine and stare at the metal like it had betrayed him. But the knock never came. The Farmall ran the way it always had. Slow, steady, honest. Danny didn't talk about the repair much, because farmers learn early that bragging invites trouble. He just worked. Every morning he started the tractor, listened for a few seconds, and then went out to the fields. Plowing, planting, dragging the harrow across the red Oklahoma dirt the way his father had done for years. By the time spring turned into summer, the story had moved through Caddo County the way stories always do in small places, quietly, then suddenly everywhere. Someone told a neighbor that Danny Jarvis had welded a crankshaft. The neighbor laughed and repeated it at the feed store. Another man said he'd seen the tractor running himself. By the end of that week, the story had turned into something slightly bigger than the truth. The kid who fixed a tractor everyone else said was dead. The first person who brought him something to repair wasn't a stranger. It was his neighbor, Bill Carter, who showed up one evening with a broken hydraulic cylinder in the back of his pickup. Bill leaned against the truck while Danny looked at the damage. "Dealer says I need a new one," Bill said. "Couple $100. Danny turned the cylinder in his hands and studied the fracture. "Maybe," he said. Bill scratched his chin. "But I heard you fixed that crankshaft." Danny shrugged. "That's what people say." Bill grinned a little. "You think you could weld this?" Danny didn't answer right away. He had learned something important from that tractor repair. The problem wasn't whether something could be fixed. The problem was whether it should be. He looked closer, thought through the stress points, and finally nodded. "I can try." Bill laughed. "That's good enough for me." It took Danny less than an hour. When Bill came back the next day and bolted the cylinder back onto his equipment, it worked. Word spread a little faster after that. By the fall of 1969, people from farms a few miles away started showing up at Danny's barn with things that dealers had already written off. Cracked housings, snapped brackets, bent shafts. Some of them were reparable. Some weren't. Danny was honest about that. But more often than anyone expected, he found a way to bring those pieces back to life. He didn't charge much, usually just enough to cover materials and a little extra if the job took longer than expected. These were his neighbors, people who were just as careful with money as he was. What started as the occasional favor slowly turned into a steady line of work. Danny cleared out more space in the barn and set up a proper welding area. A used lathe appeared one winter, bought cheap from a mechanic who was closing his shop. A milling machine came later, also used, also repaired by Danny before it was fully functional. Every tool he added made the next job a little easier. But through all of it, the Farmall H kept running. Season after season, the weld inside the crankshaft spun thousands of times every minute without complaint. Sometimes Danny would pause at the end of a long day and think about Carl Becker's voice telling him the repair wouldn't last a month. It had already lasted more than a year. By 1972, the nickname started appearing. Danny didn't invent it. Someone else did. Junkyard Danny. At first it was meant as a joke. The guy who fixed junk. The guy people went to when they didn't want to buy something new. But the tone changed quickly once people realized that junk was often just equipment waiting for someone patient enough to understand it. Farmers began driving 20, 30, even 50 miles to bring their broken machines to the Jarvis farm. Danny never advertised. He didn't need to. Reputation traveled faster than any sign. While Danny's small repair work slowly grew, life across the county was moving in a different direction. The 1970s were good years for farming. Prices were strong, credit was easy, and equipment companies were producing bigger, faster tractors every season. Carl Becker's dealership was thriving. Rows of brand-new green machines rolled onto the lot week after week, and farmers came in with confidence that the future would keep paying for whatever they bought. Carl had always been good at selling, and now the timing made him look like a genius. "You can't keep running old equipment forever," he'd say while walking customers through the showroom. "The new models are more efficient, more power, less downtime. That old tractor of yours is costing you money every day you keep it." The argument made sense. Most farmers trusted Carl. They traded in machines that had already been paid off and signed loans for newer ones that promised higher yields and easier work. Carl watched the contracts pile up and felt like the county was finally catching up with the modern world. Out on the Jarvis farm, Danny kept doing the same thing he'd always done. He worked his 160 acres and repaired equipment at night when someone knocked on the barn door. The contrast between the two men's paths wasn't obvious yet. Carl was expanding. Danny was just surviving. But the difference in philosophy was already there, quietly shaping the future. Carl believed the solution to broken equipment was replacement. Danny believed the solution was understanding how the machine worked in the first place. One afternoon in 1975, a farmer named Ed Walker drove nearly 40 miles to reach Danny's place. His combine had a cracked transmission housing that the dealer told him would cost nearly $1,000 to replace. Ed climbed out of his truck, looking exhausted. "They say it's scrap," he said. Danny wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to look. The crack was ugly, deep, running across a section of metal that took a lot of stress. Danny crouched down and studied it in silence while Ed waited. You think it could be fixed? Ed finally asked. Danny stood up slowly. I think it might, he said. Ed laughed decidedly. Dealer said, no chance. Danny shrugged the same way he always did when someone mentioned what dealers said. Dealers sell parts, he replied. I fix things. That job took nearly 2 full days, but when Ed drove away, the combine was working again. The story spread like wildfire after that. If something's broken and the dealer tells you to replace it, people started saying, take it to Junkyard Danny first. By the end of the decade, Danny's barn looked less like a simple farm building and more like a working repair shop. Old engines lined one wall. Shelves filled with salvaged parts covered another. Farmers came by not just to drop off equipment, but to stand around and talk while Danny worked. They shared stories about crops, weather, prices, and the constant gamble of farming. Danny listened more than he spoke. Meanwhile, Carl Becker's world was beginning to shift in ways he didn't fully understand yet. The boom years of the 1970s had encouraged farmers to borrow heavily. Land values were climbing, banks were eager to lend, and the belief that good times would continue forever felt almost natural. Carl sold tractors faster than ever, often financed through loans that stretched years into the future. But booms have a habit of ending quietly before anyone notices. By the early 1980s, the first signs of trouble appeared. Interest rates climbed. Crop prices slipped. Land that had been worth a fortune on paper suddenly wasn't. Farmers who had taken on large loans to buy new equipment found themselves struggling to make payments. Carl began repossessing tractors from customers who had once walked into his dealership with confidence. The machines returned to his lot, but this time there weren't as many buyers waiting to replace them. Each repossession was a reminder that the system he had trusted was beginning to crack. Across the county, the response from farmers was simple: stop buying new. Fix what you already have. That shift changed everything. The same farmers who once walked through Carl's showroom now drove past it with broken equipment heading toward the Jarvis farm. Danny never celebrated their problems. He understood too well what it meant when a man showed up desperate to keep a machine alive because he couldn't afford another one. But the work kept coming, and with each job his reputation grew. By 1983, Carl Becker's dealership was in serious trouble. The lot was filled with repossessed tractors nobody could afford. The bank had started asking questions about loans Carl himself had taken to keep the business expanding. He still believed things would turn around. After all, they always had before. But each month the numbers got harder to ignore. And out on the Jarvis farm, the old Farmall H kept running like it had something to prove. $15 worth of welding rods spinning quietly at the heart of the engine, while a county slowly learned the difference between replacing what's broken and fixing what you already have. Neither Danny nor Carl knew yet that their paths were about to cross again in a way neither of them could have predicted. But the moment was getting closer with every tractor Carl lost and every broken machine that rolled into Danny Jarvis's barn. By 1984, the mood in Caddo County had changed in a way people could feel even if nobody said it out loud. For almost a decade, the conversation at feed stores and cafes had been about expansion. Bigger tractors, more land, higher yields. But now the tone was different. The talk was quieter. Farmers didn't stand around bragging about what they were buying anymore. They talked about what they were trying not to lose. The farm crisis didn't arrive all at once like a storm. It crept in slowly. Interest rates climbed first. Loans that had once felt manageable suddenly doubled in weight. Then crop prices dropped. Land that had been worth a small fortune just a few years earlier was now barely covering the debt tied to it. And when the numbers stopped working, the banks stopped pretending they would. Out at Becker Equipment, Carl Becker began spending more time in his office staring at paperwork than he did walking the lot. The tractors were still there, rows of them lined up like they always had been, but something about them felt different now. Instead of symbols of progress, they looked like reminders of promises that hadn't worked out. Repossession had become part of Carl's weekly routine. He hated that part of the job. Calling a farmer he'd known for years and telling him the bank was taking back the tractor was never easy. But business was business, and Carl had built his entire career on the belief that if you stayed practical long enough, the numbers would always come back around. Except this time they didn't. One morning he walked across the lot and realized more machines had been returned than sold that month. The bank noticed too. Meetings became more frequent. Conversations became shorter. The word liability started appearing in places it never had before. Carl tried to keep the dealership moving forward the way he always had. Promotions. Carl Becker had been the man you went to when you needed equipment. The idea that his business could disappear felt almost unreal. The auction was scheduled for a Saturday in April. Farmers showed up early that morning, not because they were eager, but because they were curious. Some of them had bought their first tractors from Carl. Others had simply passed through his lot so many times that the place felt familiar. Now they stood in small groups watching the auctioneer prepare his notes, while rows of equipment waited to be sold piece by piece. Danny Jarvis arrived quietly and stood near the back of the crowd. Most people didn't notice him at first. The men who did recognize him nodded in greeting, but didn't say much. They knew Danny well enough to understand that he wasn't the kind of person who came to something like this for entertainment. The auction began with the smaller items. Tools, spare parts, old attachments. The auctioneer moved quickly, his voice rising and falling in the steady rhythm of someone who had spent years turning hesitation into bids. Some equipment sold for far less than it had been worth just a few years earlier. A tractor that might once have brought $30,000 now struggled to reach half that. It wasn't because the machines had changed. It was because the money in the county had. As the morning went on, the crowd slowly thinned. Some people had found what they came for. Others had simply realized they couldn't afford to bid on anything. By the time the auction reached the final item, only a handful of buyers remained. The building itself, the large metal structure that had housed Becker equipment for decades. The auctioneer adjusted his hat and looked out over the crowd. "We'll start the bidding at $60,000, he called. That number was far below what the property would have been worth during the boom years, but everyone there understood the reality of the moment. A few hands lifted hesitantly. 62. 65. The numbers moved slowly. Then a voice near the back said 70. Several heads turned. Danny Jarvis stood there with one hand raised, his expression calm. The men around him exchanged looks. They all knew who he was, and they all knew something else. Danny had spent nearly 2 decades repairing equipment instead of buying new. While others had taken on loans during the good years, Danny had built his small business piece by piece. The bidding continued for a few more rounds. 72. 75. Danny answered each offer without raising his voice. Just a small nod to the auctioneer each time the price climbed. Eventually the numbers reached $82,000. The crowd went quiet. No one else lifted a hand. The auctioneer looked around once more to be sure. Then he brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed across the lot. Sold. $82,000 to Mr. Jarvis. For a moment, Danny just stood there while the crowd absorbed what had happened. Then he walked forward to sign the paperwork. As he reached the table, he felt someone step beside him. Danny turned his head and saw Carl Becker standing there. Carl looked older than Danny remembered. The confidence that had once filled his posture was gone, replaced by the tired expression of a man who had watched something important slip away piece by piece. Carl looked at the building, then at the papers Danny was signing. "I suppose you're feeling pretty good right now," he said quietly. Danny paused before answering. "No, sir," he said. "I'm not." Carl studied him for a moment, unsure whether to believe that. Danny finished signing the documents and handed the pen back to the auctioneer. Then he looked back at Carl. "I remember what it felt like standing in your parking lot with $23 and a broken tractor," Danny said. "I remember thinking everything was over." Carl didn't say anything for a while. Finally, he asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind for 18 years. "That weld," he said slowly. "The one I told you wouldn't last a month." Danny smiled slightly. "Still holding," he replied. Carl nodded once and let out a quiet breath. 18 years, he said. "Guess I was wrong about that one." Danny folded the papers and looked at the building that now belonged to him. The same building where a man had once laughed at the idea that a cracked crankshaft could be saved. The same building where a young farmer with $23 had been told some things simply couldn't be fixed. Neither of them knew it yet, but the story that had started with a $15 weld was about to come full circle. For a few seconds after the gavel fell, nobody said much. Auctions are loud until they end. Then suddenly they're quiet, like everyone is waiting to see what the moment actually means. Danny Jarvis folded the paperwork the auctioneer handed him and looked around the lot one more time. 18 years earlier, he had stood in this same place as a young man with a broken tractor and $23 in his pocket. Now he owned the building, not because he had planned it that way, and not because he had spent 18 years trying to prove someone wrong. It had happened slowly, the way most real changes do, through a long series of small decisions that didn't seem important at the time. Carl Becker stood beside him for another moment before speaking again. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked, nodding toward the dealership building. Danny looked at the rows of equipment that still hadn't been moved yet. The sign that said Becker Equipment hung above the door the same way it had for decades. He thought about the farmers who had walked through those doors looking for solutions they could afford. Then he thought about the trucks that had been pulling into his barn for years, carrying broken parts people couldn't replace anymore. Danny shrugged slightly. "Same thing I've been doing," he said, "just with a bigger roof." Carl gave a tired laugh. "Fixing things," he said. Danny nodded. "Fixing things." They stood there quietly for another moment. Finally, Carl cleared his throat. "You need any help?" he asked. The question hung in the air longer than either man expected. 20 years earlier, Carl had been the expert, and Danny had been the kid asking questions. Now the positions had quietly reversed. Danny thought about it for a second, not because he wanted to make Carl uncomfortable, but because he wanted to answer honestly. "Can you start Monday?" he asked. Carl looked surprised for half a second. Then he smiled in a way Danny had never seen before. Not confident, not proud, just grateful. "I think I can manage that," he said. The new sign went up 2 months later. The old green John Deere lettering came down, and in its place a simpler sign appeared above the building. Jarvis Repair. Underneath it, in smaller letters, Danny added a line that made the people in the county smile when they read it. "We fix what dealers won't." The shop opened its doors that June, right in the middle of the farm crisis. From the first week, the place was busy. Farmers came from miles away with equipment that had been sitting idle because nobody thought it could be saved. Tractors, combines, trucks. Sometimes whole machines were hauled in pieces because the owners had given up hope of ever seeing them run again. Danny worked the way he always had. Quiet, patient, one repair at a time. Carl answered the phones, kept track of paperwork, and sometimes wandered into the shop to watch Danny work. It took him a while to understand what made the younger man different from most mechanics he had known. One afternoon, Carl leaned against the workbench while Danny welded a crack along the side of an old engine block. The torch buzzed steadily for a few seconds before Danny lifted the mask and checked the bead. Carl shook his head slowly. "You know something I finally figured out working here?" he said. Danny wiped his hands and glanced over. "What's that?" Carl nodded toward the engine. "For 30 years, I told farmers they needed new machines. Told them their old equipment was junk." Danny waited. Carl exhaled slowly. "Most of it wasn't junk," he said. "Most of it just needed somebody willing to fix it." Danny didn't answer right away. Then he shrugged. "Machines aren't that different from people," he said. "They break in predictable places. If you understand how they work, you can usually put them back together." Carl chuckled quietly. "You sound like that shop teacher you told me about." Danny smiled. "Mr. Patterson," he said. "He's the one who taught me how to weld." Carl looked over toward the far corner of the building where an old red tractor sat parked near the front door. The Farmall H hadn't been used regularly in years by that point. Danny kept it there on purpose. The paint had faded, and the metal carried the scars of decades of work, but the machine still looked solid in the way old farm equipment often does. Carl walked over and rested his hand on the fender. "That the one?" he asked. Danny nodded. "Same one." Carl tapped the engine block lightly. "Still the same crankshaft?" Danny nodded again. "Same weld, too." Carl laughed, but this time there was no disbelief in the sound. "You know how long it's been now?" he asked. Danny didn't have to think about it. "Almost 20 years. Carl shook his head in quiet amazement. "I told you a month," he said. Danny leaned against the workbench and folded his arms. "You were right about one thing, though," he said. Carl looked back at him. "What's that?" Danny pointed toward the tractor. It had to be done right. The Farmall eventually stopped running sometime in the late 1990s. Not because the weld failed. The crankshaft held the entire time. What finally ended the tractor's working life was everything else. 30 years of dust, heat, and heavy work had simply worn the rest of the machine down. When the engine finally refused to start one morning, Danny didn't scrap it. Instead, he rolled it into the front of the shop and parked it where every customer would see it when they walked through the door. Then he bolted a small metal sign next to the hood. The sign read, 1952 Farmall H. Crankshaft welded in 1968 for $15. They said it wouldn't last a month. It lasted 30 years. Farmers began bringing their kids to the shop just to see it. Old men would stand beside the tractor and tell the story to younger mechanics who had never known a world without modern equipment. The story changed a little every time someone told it, the way good stories always do, but the important part stayed the same. A young farmer, $23. A broken tractor everyone said was finished, and a decision to try anyway. Danny ran Jarvis Repair for decades after that. The shop became a place people trusted, not because every repair worked perfectly, but because Danny never stopped trying to understand the machines that came through the door. When he finally retired in 2008 at the age of 72, his son Michael took over the business. Michael had grown up in that shop, watching his father work the same way Danny had once watched his own father work in the fields. One afternoon, while they were closing up for the day, Michael asked the question most young mechanics eventually ask. What's the most important thing about fixing equipment? Danny thought about it for a moment before answering. Believing it can be fixed, he said. Michael raised an eyebrow. That's it. Danny smiled. Most people quit before they even start, he said. They hear someone say it's impossible, and they stop thinking. Michael looked toward the old Farmall, sitting quietly by the door. And the second most important thing? He asked. Danny chuckled softly. Learning the skills to prove them wrong. In 2012, the Caddo County Historical Society organized a small ceremony outside the repair shop to recognize Danny's contribution to the community. The crowd that showed up was larger than Danny expected. Farmers, mechanics, neighbors, people whose equipment he had repaired over the years. They gathered around the old tractor while a plaque was unveiled next to it. Danny stood in front of them, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention. He had never thought of himself as someone worth honoring. He cleared his throat and spoke the way he always did, plain and direct. I'm not much for speeches, he began. I'm better with a welding torch. The crowd laughed softly. Danny gestured toward the Farmall behind him. Back in 1968, I was 22 years old and pretty sure my farm was about to fail, he said. When that crankshaft cracked, I thought it was the end. He paused and looked across the crowd. A man told me I had two choices. Pay $800 I didn't have or give up. Danny smiled slightly. He also told me it couldn't be fixed. The crowd glanced at the old tractor. Danny nodded toward it. Turns out the metal wasn't the problem, he said. The problem was what people believed about it. He stepped back from the microphone after that. The applause that followed wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried the kind of respect that grows slowly over many years. Danny Jarvis passed away in 2019 at the age of 83. He was buried behind a family farmhouse beside his parents. On his gravestone, the family carved a simple sentence that captured the life he had lived better than any long speech could have. Danny Jarvis, 1946 to 2019. He fixed what couldn't be fixed. Jarvis Repair still operates today under Michael's care. The tools have changed. The machines are newer, but the philosophy inside the shop remains the same. And every person who walked through the door still passes the old Farmall H sitting near the entrance with the small metal sign beside it. A quiet reminder that sometimes the difference between scrap metal and a working machine is nothing more than the willingness to try one more time when someone else says it can't be done.